welcome to the Oneida County History Center. My name is Rebecca McLean. I am the Executive Director here, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this wonderful program, Built to Last, the legacy of the CCC and the Tug Hill Region. Today's program is created in partnership with the Tug Hill Commission. So I'd like to welcome next Patricia Shulenburg, who will get the program started. She is the project specialist for the Tug Hill Commission, and I hope you enjoy today's program. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us both online and in person today. We've got a really great program ahead for you. To start off the program, we will hear from Marty Podskoch. He's an author and historian. He will talk about CCC camps, followed by Herb Thorpe. He's going to give a firsthand account. He was a former CCC member and a Tuskegee Airman. After that, we'll take a short break. Both Marty and Herb provided video recordings of their presentation today. Thank you. We will be following the break to talk about CCC camps in the Tug Hill region and projects, followed by Ann Harrison from the New York State DEC to talk about the legacy of the CCC at the DEC. And to follow and cap off the program, we'll hear from Maria Cipullo to talk about projects at state parks. So to start us off with Marty Podskoch. He's an author, historian from East Hampton, Connecticut. He's documented CCC camps in the Adirondacks and the Tug Hill region. Let's hear from Marty.
Hi, I'm Marty Podskoch from East Hampton, Connecticut. I'm originally from the Catskills, Delhi, New York, where I taught for 30 years. And I got interested in writing books because I used to have book fairs and authors came, and my whole idea was to get my kids interested in reading and writing by meeting top authors. And I got interested in writing myself, and these are some of the books that I've done on the Catskills and the Adirondacks. I first got interested in fire towers when I hiked Hunter Mountain and met a fire tower observer, and he said this was the greatest job in the world. And I told the publisher somebody should write a book. That was in 1987. I climbed the mountain, and then in 97 he said, "How would you like to write a book?" And so I was thrilled to be an author. And I interviewed a lot of people, and I got my first book done. Came out in the year 2000. And then I said, I'm going to go up and do the Adirondacks. So I did the first the Southern Towers, because there were a total of 57 towers. And it was a 2-hour drive just from my house there. And so I was lucky to meet a lady who used to get writers and speakers to go to all over the Adirondacks. And so she would plug me in all these different towns, and I gave talks, and people would take me in for the night, and then I would go to another town. And this is the way I got my information, because there weren't any books on fire towers. So all these towns, I got to know. So then I did a book on the northern fire towers. And this is the one on St. Peter's, or St. Oh boy, I can't even remember, St. Regis. So I did all these fire towers. And then somebody up there in Saranac Lake, she had photos of the Civilian Conservation Corps camp along with her fire tower pictures. Her dad was in charge of all of the fire towers, all the forest rangers in the northern Adirondacks. Her uncle was Clarence Petty. So I was able to find a lot of pictures, so I went from fire towers to the Great Depression and Civilian Conservation Corps. So those probably have read about how bad the Depression was. 25% of the people were unemployed, people were starving, there were soup kitchens, and we had a new president, President Roosevelt. When he came into office, he said, I propose to create a civilian conservation corps to be used in simple work. More important, however, than the material gains will be the more moral and spiritual value of such a work. So this was the beginning of the CCCs, and he had a choice. Who was going to run these camps? And he chose the Army because he knew that they could be able to supply the food, clothing, shelter, medical care for the boys that were in the CCC. And so here's a picture in Paul Smith's, them building the barracks and different buildings for the young boys to live in. And the CCCs were available to any boys 18 to 25. The Department of Labor, through its state and local relief offices, did the choosing. So everything was based on population. So New York at that time was the largest population, so they had the most CCC camps and most CCC boys. So towns were like Albany. New York City, of course, would get a lot of boys because they have a larger population. So those boys had the chance to sign up if they wanted to. It was all voluntary. And they would go through a physical inspection, and most of the boys passed. There's the bottom picture. They were given clothing from World War I, because the Army had just from March until July, or even a little bit earlier, to get clothing, and captains, Army officers, to be able to run these camps, get the trucks, all the equipment. So the boys were assigned to a camp. They didn't have a choice. Some of the boys stayed in New York. Some boys went up to Vermont, Massachusetts. Some went New Hampshire. Some went all the way out to Colorado, California. And the Army was in charge of transporting the boys from the local town. Some were by bus, trucks, and boys or by train. And here's the boys getting the clothes. So now they had new shoes, socks, underwear, and nice woolen clothes too for the winter time. And for the working, they had the jeans. And at first they stayed in tents, and that summer of July, August, September, and October. And they were given now food, clothing, shelter. And this is one of the barracks. They weren't insulated. They had about 3 stoves and about 40 boys per barracks. There were 5 barracks, totaling 200 boys per camp. And you could just imagine having 18 to 25-year-old boys in one big room. So I'm sure there were disputes, and the Army decided, hey, let's have somebody be a leader. Forgot to tell you, these boys were given $1 a day, so it was $30 a month. $25 went straight home to the parents in the mail, and the boys were given $5 spending money. Now, if you were the leader of this barracks, you were paid $45 a month instead of $30. And he also, it would pick somebody who would be the assistant. So you need somebody good with discipline. So they'd get some big guys to be the leaders, and system leader was paid $36. You see, the boys, everything was kept very neatly because the boys had inspections. And if they did not meet the inspection for their barracks or wherever they were doing, they wouldn't be able to get leave on the weekend if they were close by to hitchhike home, or to go to the dances or go to the movies into town. They were also given medical care. So each camp, can you believe this, had an Army doctor. They even had a traveling dentist who went around and did work. Sometimes later on, maybe if they didn't have a doctor, they would hire a local doctor and take the boys to the local dentist. And here a picture of one of the camps in July and August, September, before the barracks were built. And the boys, 6 o'clock in the morning, they had to get up and go to the latrine and get ready, make sure their barracks was in good shape, and everything was in neat and order for breakfast. Then they would go out and for reveille, raising of the flag, and then they were checked to see if everybody made it back from the weekend. If they weren't, they would be AWOL, and that would go on their records. Sometimes you had boys too, they would just run away. They just could not take this type of life in the country or wilderness, wherever they were stationed, and they would just run away, but the Army did not chase them. They just would be on their record, AWOL. Then the boys would go and do work. Now the Army wasn't in charge of them now at 8 o'clock. They were in charge in the state conservation department. And they, the foresters, they had a supervisor who would be doing the planning, superintendent of the camp. And his job would be to plan all the projects, assign the boys to work. And here they are going to work, and they would hire maybe somebody who was a good mason, an electrician, who was a logger. And they would have this squad of about 11 to 12 boys. They would get into a truck, could be an Army truck or a state truck, a canvas truck, and they would spend the 8 hours at an 8-hour day working at whatever projects there were. Could be building a state park, building a dam, cutting the trees in the forest, or fighting insects, any jobs that they had. So these guys who supervised them, the local guys, are called LEMs, local experienced men. Then in the morning, they would hop on trucks. Here they are gathering together. You could see the two Army guys supervising. They're probably happy. We'll have peace and quiet for 8 hours. Now, this didn't mean that all 200 boys were going out. They also had boys that stayed. They had boys that were good with typing. They would work in the office, keeping track of all the records for the boys, all the equipment used, the nails, any correspondences. You also had a group of boys that worked in the kitchen. So that would be their job. And they would have to get up early in the morning in order to get cooking for the boys to have breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. If you got into trouble or you just needed boys, you were placed on KP duty, kitchen patrol duty. And this was like in the early 1933, the summer. You could see how everything was neatly done because the Army was in charge. Then when the boys were working in the woods at 12 o'clock, they would have an hour off for lunch. A lot of the boys loved to toaster sandwiches. Here they are having some lunch. And what was their favorite sandwich? Peanut butter and jelly. Then they would be back to work. Here, a top photo is boys working around Indian Lake, getting some rocks. And at first, too, they didn't have things to break up the rocks, so they had a lot of sledgehammers. So if they needed gravel, crushed rock, The boys would go to town just smashing up rocks. The bottom photo shows the tallest guy there. He was a boy from below Lowville, and his dad and he did forestry work, logging. So he was placed in charge of this group of boys, and they work in the forest, maybe taking down all the dead trees. And of course, you see the guy on the bottom left, he's just relaxing. And many times you'd have gold brickers, guys that would just try to get out of work, you know, get lost in the woods, you know, for a little while. So while everybody else was working. Where I'm at. And then at 4 o'clock, they would come back and then get dressed, cleaned up for supper time. And here the boys in line, the guy who took this picture, he said, Marty, I had long legs and I could run up, be the first one in line. And there are the barracks in the background. Now, you can see these are older guys. How did they get in the CCC? Well, there were also veterans camps, okay? These were guys that were in World War I, or even guys that were in the Spanish-American War of 1898. They were unemployed, and they came to Washington in 1932 when Hoover was president, and they said, please give us our bonus that we were promised that was supposed to come in 1946. We need that bonus now. They set up their tents, they paraded, they marched on the Capitol. Please, Congress, please, President, give us our bonus. And Hoover sent MacArthur, I should say, and drove them out along with Eisenhower. And then I should go back a little bit. Then in 1933, when Roosevelt was president, they came again. But he's a politician. Why have disruptors? Okay, let's get these boys, these veterans jobs too. So he assigned veterans camps. And there's also a canteen in the recreation hall where they had pool tables, ping pong, nice fireplace for reading. And this boy here, he was an assistant leader paid. And so his job, all he had to do was stay in the camp and order and sell food at nighttime and also on weekends. But he was paid $36 a week, month. One of my brain. And then on weekends, the boys would get together and have bands and play. And they'd have different entertainment for themselves. Sports too, just like in high school. High schools have sports to keep the boys busy, great for physical. And on the weekends, the boys played local CCC camps or town teams. And the money that they made from selling food, cigarettes, ice cream, soda, candy at the canteen, they would use that to buy equipment for the sports. Also, they would have competition. Here's one with sawing. Then on Sundays, the boys who wanted to go to church, sometimes a chaplain would come to the camp. Or they would have a truck going to the nearby town for maybe a mass if the Catholic or Protestant church. And it was all voluntary, but Sunday was a day of rest. The boys who worked in the kitchen, sometimes they would be sent down to the fort down by Philadelphia and maybe spend a week just learning how to cook, or it could have been even the camp maybe at Plattsburgh. These boys, most of them didn't have driver's license. And so they had to teach these boys how to drive. and maintain the trucks. So every camp, if you can imagine, look at about 15 trucks. Could have been the dump trucks, you know, for getting the gravel for the roads that they did work, or the rack trucks there. And these were probably maybe Dodge trucks. They're pretty good at doing this. Roosevelt did not like Henry Ford because he got an award from Hitler. And he said, I'm not buying anything from that guy. Then they said, hey, these boys only have an 8th grade education, some less than an 8th grade education. So in the evenings, let's teach them, okay? They're only signed up, the boys, I forgot to tell you too, they would sign up for 6 months. And then they could sign up for another 6 months, another 6 months, up to 2 years. And then they would have to leave. So while they were in camp, they hired teachers to be and set up programs. Could be reading, writing, and arithmetic, help them to get their GED from high school or elementary school, or it could be mechanics. Another popular, typing was really popular with the boys. And they would get certificates, and some of these with truck driving too, certificates, mechanics. And each camp had their own camp newspaper. Here's the Adirondack Range in Fort Henry. And so they came out every month, and the education advisor helped supervise these groups of boys that wrote the stories, laid them out, cranked them out on the mimeograph machine. And every week, the national newspaper, Happy Days, came out, and it was news having to do with all of the CCC camps throughout the United States. And sometimes you might be able to find these on eBay or some of the historical societies if you need to find out what was going. Now, what did these boys accomplish? Bridges. Just look at the amount of bridges at some of these state parks that have been produced. This one is right above Northville. They built roads, planted billions of trees throughout the United States. They fought insects because they wanted to keep the trees growing. And one of them was blister rust. Now, blister rust, they found out this disease has a lifespan, but it's part of it is living on the currant and gooseberry bushes. And if they could eliminate currant and gooseberry bushes, this fungus could not get up into the white pine trees. So the boys would go out in the springtime and rip up the gooseberries and currant bushes in the forest. Anything within 900 feet of a plantation of white pine trees, they were ripped up, even going on people's farms, properties, if they were near white pine trees. And a big one was the caterpillars, gypsy moths. Look, they would have millions of eggs in these egg masses that were attached to the tree bottom left. And you know the devastation that they do. And so the boys would have to climb up trees, find those egg masses, and they painted them with creosote. Another big job was fighting fires. They built these fire breaks. So if a fire was coming, they would clear the land ahead of the fire and then start a backfire so that that fire would go towards the oncoming fire and stop it. Truck trails were built into the forest. They built dams. And then they also did try to stop erosion on streams. You see the guys on the logs, it's called riprap. The bottom left, putting rocks along the curve of the stream. Recreation. They built parks, Moffett Beach, Fish Creek, 8th Lake. These are just some of the lakes or the parks in the Adirondacks. Natural disasters. Say if a flood happened, the roads were damaged. They would call the guys at the CCC camp, and the boys would leave the camp and clear the roads, clear out cellars that in the cities that were from the mud, etc. Major accomplishments. They did reforestation, improvement of parks and forests. They worked on disease, insect pest control. Over 220,700 men enrolled in the CC, the largest number in the United States. The state operated an average of 68 camps a year in New York, and over $134 million was spent on this program, and most of it all came from the federal government. If you ever get a chance, this is a book that I ran across at the bookstore there in Lake Placid when it was going. Paid $70 for this. And it turned out that every state, the 48 states, had a yearbook like this. And it had a little history, and it also had the pictures of the enrollees and also some of the things that they did. So if you ever want to find out what happened in the CCC, this is a great one to get. Now, this is the Schenectady district. So this yearbook doesn't control the part of the Tug Hill Plateau in Boonville. That was governed by the Binghamton district. And I did find out, I think it was the Nestle's factory that's there today is where the Binghamton district was. And they controlled all the work from the Tug Hill Plateau all the way out west. Now, this is a listing of all the camps that I did for my book that were in or right next to the Adirondacks. And just shows you the picture of them. See the Boonville and the Harrisville camp. These camps would have been in the Binghamton district. The other ones were in the Schenectady district. It's where Price Chopper warehouses are. I know where that is. The town right next to Schenectady. Now, I'm going to show you the Boonville camp. Okay, you know where Boonville is, and the Hawkinsville or Hogsback Road. On that road is where the CCC camp was there, and almost all of the buildings are gone. This is a group picture, 1938 picture that I was able to get. They did reforestation. That land around there, the Hogsback Road there was sort of like sandy, so they had to learn how to plant trees and so that the wind wouldn't destroy or be covered up by sand. They fought insects and tree diseases, built a lot of truck and foot trails, did stream improvement, stocked fish, did survey work, built parks, fought fires, did fire prevention work such as building fire breaks and fire towers too. And if you ever go into the, if I could remember the district office there, they have all the maps of the projects that the Boonville camp did, color-coded. It's just believed, starts with an H. It'll come to my brain. And here's a picture of what the camp looked like. And this is a picture, there's the parade ground where they do the reveille. And see that White House? That's the neighbor across the street from the Hogsback Road. And the buildings. And they even had a side camp on Potato Hill. It was called S-122, Company 1241. And there's a picture of the bottom left, was off to work. And look at the fleet of trucks they had. There the boys went whenever they could find gooseberries, they would pull them out and let them dry because they did not want to have the white pine trees die. Here shows a picture of them doing a truck trail, fire lane. They needed these trails in the woods in order to take out the logs and also to get in there to fight fires. Here's the boys taking a rest, working in the woods, doing some silviculture work. Silva means trees. Okay. In 1941, the CCU did silviculture work on 313 acre section. Sometimes they worked private land or state land. One of the big projects was they worked at Pixley Falls State Park, which is below Boonville, the village, on Route 46. They set up a side camp there, meaning instead of having to drive back and forth every day to the main camp, they would set up tents and stay there. Then on weekends, they would go back. Even some of the fireplaces and the shelter is still there. This is a copy from my book of all the different projects they did, and just too numerous to mention. But you could get my book or stop the film. Here, of course, some of the boys, I was lucky to get some of the pictures of boys pulling around. Boxing was really big. Friday night, they would have their boxing matches there. One guy said, Marty, they would be throwing quarters or nickels, pennies on the ring after the match. And he said, I had such a hard time picking up coins with my gloves on. They would find a stream or lake to go swimming. Joe Gaetano from Dallsville was my buddy. Man, did he have lots of pictures. He came from Utica. The Gaetanos, the bakery there was a great bakery right next to the movie theater, a restaurant. And the two brothers, that was Joe Gaetano was their uncle. And the one brother still has a restaurant there, serves, I think, luncheon, fabulous food. And I got to know him when we brought Joe into the restaurant there. Oh, Uncle Joe, give him hugs and kisses. But he had so many stories, some of the stories I couldn't even print. And holiday dinner, it was a festive occasion. And there is many times, whenever I needed a place to stay, I'd stay in Dallsville. And there was Joe. He'd be making me the red peppers and onions. And then he'd also make me a sandwich to go on my way. I just so sad when Joe passed away. He was the town barber in Dallsville till I think he was 92. He was still cutting hair. And he had on his porch, he had the barber's chair. Another guy I met was Marion Francis from Harrisville. And he also lived in Watertown later years. And he was at the Boonville camp, and he had a lot of pictures. After the camp was closed in 41, the Boonville camp was used as a prisoner of war camp. You believe that? And I also got into writing these called Adirondack stories that appear in the Boonville, Lowville paper each week. I guess Rome has them, and they did this for 5 years. A different caption like this every year, like believe it or not. And one of them was the Boonville camp. And they had the boys, fence around it, guard tower. People who spoke German from Boonville would stop and talk to the prisoners. And then during the day, a lot of times they did work in the forest or doing work for farmers. Now look at the legacy that they have. Our forest, if you go down that road, Hogsback Road there, where today is the remains, there's the DEC office. There's a nice dam on that road. Pixley Farm. And if you go in there, this is where the camp was. But buildings basically are gone. And when I took Joe there, Gaetano, he just cried. He said, I can't believe my camp is gone. It had so many wonderful memories. And you could see the white pine trees. Before that was just all sandy, open land. The old Boy Scout camp, Russell camp, there's one building there that they moved, took apart and rebuilt it. And I guess they sold the camp off, but maybe that building is still there. They did the Gomer Fire Tower. They built that in 1940. And there's Joe and a guy from Little Falls, Ted Roy. I would take him to the Utica Historical Society there. And these guys would tell their stories about being in the CCC. Harrisville was another camp above there. And then World War II came. We did not need the boys working conservation work. We needed them to fight the war. So they were sent off to war. The camps were closed. But this is one that's still buildings. Most of the buildings are still there in Speculator, Lake Pleasant. It was made into a camp, 4-H camp, and then later on a person bought it. And now I don't know what the transition is going to be. Another prisoner of war camp was the Harrisville camp, and that was German too, and POWs. And today, look at the legacy we have. Cranberry State Lake, Frank Jadwin Memorial. And each year we have a gathering of CCC family and members. This was a gathering back in 2014 that I did in Connecticut. And this is when I was able to get a lot of the guys in their 90s. All of these guys, sad to say, have passed away. Even that guy, the second to the right, with the light blue shirt, he just passed away in December, 104. So I just enjoyed saving these stories. If you want to read some stories, get my book. I've done about 100 guys of New York State, guys that went out west from New York, guys in Connecticut. I've got a book on Connecticut, Rhode Island, and now I'm in Vermont doing that one. I also did a travel book to all the 102 towns, and this is where I live in Connecticut. It's called Lake Pocatapog. So every day I just look out my window at the lake, and I'm lucky we have 2 little cottages too. And I hate oil. I just have solar, geothermal, and hopefully I'll be able to get a full electric car maybe next year if I'm lucky on my 80th birthday. So we have Prius cars, and I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. And this is my family. I've got 3 kids, Christy, and 2 boys, Ryan, Matthew. One bachelor lives in Norwalk, and one Reading, the big one on the right. And he married Jenna. She's got the 2 twin girls. And Luke, I'm holding, 2 years old. And my daughter, Christy, with her 2 girls, 15 and almost 17. So thanks a lot for having me. And if you have any questions, read my book. And here are my other Adirondack and Catskill books. Hope you'll enjoy reading them. Thank you.
Marty was talking about the history from a sort of historian's perspective, third-person point of view. But when do we record this, Dennis? It was snowing a couple months ago. Many people may have heard of Mr. Thorpe primarily as a Tuskegee Airman, right? He was one of the first completely African-American bunch of airmen that trained in Tuskegee. And Mr. Thorpe was one of the last ones alive who was a Tuskegee Airman. But I asked him to talk about something else because it turns out that after being born in 1924 and growing up in Brooklyn, he ended up in a CCC camp in the metropolis of Empeyville, New York. Does anyone know where Empeyville is? You do. You're cheating. It's out by Camden. It's an area, it's called 49 Corners, and it is literally a corner of the Tug Hill with no paved roads virtually, and more mosquitoes than anything I've seen, and probably the snowiest part of New York. So Mr. Thorpe at a young age ended up being transported to Empeyville at the CCC camp, and we recorded him several months ago right here. Well, Mr. Thorpe, on behalf of the Oneida County History Center and the Tug Hill Commission, thank you for being with us today. We're excited to hear what you have to say about the CCC and your involvement in that.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So where were you born and when?
Oh,
You can
my
scare
goodness.
us now.
You go a long way back. I was born in Manhattan, actually, New York City. And at the age of 2, I moved to Brooklyn, and I grew up in Brooklyn. I consider myself a Brooklynite.
Yeah.
That's where I'm from.
So was your employment affected by the Great Depression? Like immediately, did you feel any impact of what was going on?
We were poor, so.
You were poor.
My father worked all the time. He was a taxi driver. And he actually worked nights, and he was home, came home, and slept during the day. And of course, I didn't see that much of him because I had to go to school during the day, and I would, most of the time I was in school. From kindergarten to high school in Brooklyn, New York. And I walked every step of the way.
Did you?
From kindergarten to high school. We didn't have buses in those days.
Right. Really? So how did you get involved with the CCC?
Well, when I graduated from high school in 1940, June of 1940, I worked that summer after I graduated, odd jobs, and didn't think it was going anywhere. And I saw an announcement in the newspaper for people to enroll in what they call the CCC program. And I read a little bit about it, and I said, well, maybe that's something that I might do to get away from being wandering around the streets of Brooklyn. And I got an application, filled it out, and applied to become a member of the CCC program. I was accepted.
Right.
And they sent me tickets and not much else. And told me where I had to go.
What
So
tickets on the train?
On the train tickets, yes. And traveled by train from Brooklyn. Actually left from downtown Brooklyn. I don't know if you've heard of the Brooklyn Nets.
Baseball?
The train station was right across the street from where the Brooklyn Nets Stadium is right now.
Okay.
Long Island Railroad. And we took that train from Brooklyn to where the campsite was located near Elmira, New York. So we traveled upstate through the lower part of New York State up to Binghamton, and then from Binghamton up to Elmira. And we were met at, I think I was the only one that I recall at that time on coming that way. And they picked us up in a truck at Elmira and drove us to the camp, which was not far from Elmira, in a little town called Van Etten, New York, which is a very small farm village.
So was that like where their orientation was going on?
Yes.
Right.
That's where everything began and ended.
How long were you there?
I was there. I arrived in the fall of 1940, and I stayed in Van Etten for about a year. and they were going to start closing some of the CCC camps. So the following year, fall of the following year, those of us at Van Etten were sent to different camps. And I was sent to a camp at Empeyville.
The big metropolis of Empeyville,
The
New
big
York.
metropolis of Empeyville, which was Empeyville. If you're
So when
familiar with what Empeyville looks like,
when was
it's
that?
nothing but woods.
When did you get to Empeyville?
Probably about October of 1941. October, November, as I recall.
Did the
Something like that. I wasn't there very long, though.
Did the camp have any nicknames? Did you guys call it
Not
anything?
that I know
No.
I wasn't there. Anyway, they already had campus already were there at Empeyville. I don't know if you know anything about the CCC program, but it was instituted by President Roosevelt during the Depression, during the Great Depression, during the 30s.
Right.
And it was a national organization that he set up camps across the country to get young kids off the streets and into some kind of a...
That's great. Did any of your friends enroll, or were you kind of on your own?
I was on my own.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're on your own, believe me. You gotta learn fast.
So how did you get actually to the camp in Empeyville?
A truck.
Oh.
Yeah, trucks.
No, move you over.
They had the old-fashioned Chevrolet stake trucks on the side of the canvas over the top, benches on the side. You jumped in the back and sat on the bench, and they drove you to where you had to go.
So you're from the New York City area,
Yes.
and you ended up way out in
the middle of nowhere.
What did you think of being out there?
So what am I doing here?
A lot of stars.
City boy in the country. And it was a strange thing to come from a city and to be in the country. City, you have street lights, where the country, there's no lights.
It's scary.
Yep.
Yeah, in a way.
It is different.
So what type of work did you have you doing at the camp in Empeyville?
Well, of course, you had the orientation, which probably, it didn't take more than probably a week or so. Give you clothes to wear, uniforms, shoes, complete outfit. And we were assigned to what they call work groups. The work groups were, they were assigned to local farmers through the New York State, what they call it, Agriculture Department or whatever.
Okay.
Farmers would go to the state, said they needed help doing so and so. And the state would say, well, we got a camp of young men, boys, they call them then, that you can, use in. We have young men who are studying things like agriculture and things like that, and they would work with the farmer, find out what the farmer needed, and then they would tell the people at the camp what they had. Young CCC boys would have to do. And we would go out, and the farmer he had ditches to be dug, and he had plants to be planted, things to be planted that he needed help with. And we went out and did that kind of work. Dug a hole in the ground and stuck a shoot in the hole and covered it over and moved
Planting
to the next
trees?
one. Planted trees.
Yeah.
And dug ditches and things like that. Yeah.
So we had some graphic information that the folks brought along, and it listed sort of the daily schedule of the camp, and I was wondering if you had any insight. It said that they got you up at 6 o'clock in the morning with reveille. Was that really like a...
Yep. The camps were run by the Army. So the Army, they did it the Army way. The camps, the camp that I was in Manhattan, was run by a, I don't know where he was a civilian, I think, yeah. G.I. Howard, his name was George I. Howard, I remember him. And he worked for the state, New York State, of course. And, but the Army young men, the corporals, well, there weren't that many, really. They would tell him, well, how to line everybody up for drill and take attendance and all of that. So he would take care of all that, and he worked out of a what they call a camp office. If you knew anything about the Army worked under strict segregationist rules, so the camps were not integrated.
Oh.
The camp that I was in was segregated camp, African American, except for the leadership. The leadership of all of those camps were all white.
Gotcha.
So we got our instructions from our camp leaders, our camp guidance counselors, and they would tell us where to go, what march us off to get us into the truck, and the truck would drive us out to the farm.
Well, how many men total were at the camp?
Well, the camp that I was in was there were 5 we call them barracks.
Yep.
About 10 to each barrack, I said.
Okay.
And there was about 100, between 80 and 100 young men in the camp total.
Yeah.
But then they had other buildings. They had a mess building. They had a supply building. They had a building that served as a main office where the director sat, and his staff sat in that office. And he had people work in his office with him. He would tell them what forms to make out, and they would do that with the old-fashioned typewriters.
Yeah, right. The words go right on the paper like magic.
You had to pound on the keys.
So carrying on in the day, at 6:30 was breakfast, sick call, and policing of the site. How was breakfast?
Well, so something to eat.
Not high marks
They
there?
marched it to the mess hall, yeah, and the mess hall had the long, like I don't know if you've been to some of the state parks.
Mm-hmm.
Those picnic tables that you see.
Yeah.
The picnic table with the 2 seats on one side and seat on the other, and the table. That was what the mess hall was like. So you sat on the bench, and the cook and his crew would come and put stuff on the table, and you have a tin plate, and you take stuff out of the plate and put it on your out of the main tray and put it on your plate.
And they were able to feed everybody all in one batch?
Yeah, all at once. Yes, everybody all ate at once. Lunch, lunch was something else, because after your breakfast, they gave you a brown paper bag, which had a sandwich and a piece of fruit, and that was about it, really.
Mm-hmm.
If there's anything to drink, you had to get out at the work site. They had these big galvanized cans where they had Kool-Aid. If you heard of Kool-Aid, that was it. And you dip it out with a dipper and fill up your cup, and you drank out of that.
So after you had breakfast and stuff, you'd get your assignment for the day?
You did your assignment for the day until lunchtime, and then you had lunch. Broke for lunch for about a half an hour to an hour. Then you went back to work again, and you worked for another 3 or 4 hours, and work ended, and you got back on your truck, and the truck drove you back to the camp.
So you were working for farmers, essentially, it sounded
Essentially.
like. Did you have to bring your own tools, or did they provide what
They
you...
provided the tools. Yeah, they provided the tools. Showed you how to use them. Picks, and shovels and rakes, things like that. Yeah. Sledgehammers to break the stones up.
Apart from the work day and the meals, not that you had a lot, but what was there like spare time at camp? What else did you do?
After you got back to camp, sometime part of that evening, you had to go to dinner, of course, to the mess hall again for dinner. And after dinner, then you had spare time. And spare time is when you got to meet everybody in the camp. And you had to be careful who you met.
Oh, really? What type of things did you run into?
'Cause there were guys there, they came from all over, like New York, the camp that I was in. Most of the young men came from Harlem and Brooklyn and Buffalo and Albany. And they were, well, we used to call them city slickers. And I didn't grow up in that kind of a neighborhood, so I had to be careful with the city slickers would find ways to get you whatever you had that they wanted.
Do you think they got sent there by their family, or did they go there on their own?
They got there most likely on their own. So the camps were run by, like I say, by the Army, but they would choose some of the older campers to be supervisors, or what they call barrack leaders. Each barrack rather had a barrack leader, and he was a little older. He's probably 3 or 4 years older than the general camper, and he would tell them, where they had to go, how to line up for the trucks. He would have them stand in line, and he would assign them duties that they had to do in their spare time while they're in the barracks. He would tell them what the things they had to do. Some of us had to take care of the old belly stoves. I don't know if you remember those.
Yep.
With,
What season were
coal.
you? What season were you there?
I was there in the winter of 1940. Yeah, I left there. Van Etten, I left in the winter of 41. I went to Empeyville, from Van Etten to Empeyville. I was there for the winter of Empeyville, and from Empeyville, I was sent from Empeyville to a campsite in Beltsville, Maryland. But the thing that I took advantage of while I was at both Van Etten and Empeyville was that I had taken office classes in high school, so I knew how to type. I could use a typewriter,
Right.
so I got to work in the office.
Skills. Nice.
After I figured out how to get out and go out on the field.
Oh, so you didn't want to necessarily work with the farmers, you stayed in the office.
Not necessarily, because it's hard work.
That's smart.
And so I would do I typed the records and keep track of when they took attendance. I would type up the records for attendance, things like who said present, who said no.
Sure.
You had to make sure that if you were well enough to get up, you had to be present. And you had to say so. And the barracks leader had to verify that you were there. He had to verify that to the camp superintendent. And that's how they kept track of who was there and who wasn't.
So Empeyville is one of the snowier areas in the country.
Absolutely.
What did you think of the weather while you were up there?
I never saw so much snow in my life. Because when I was at Empeyville, we would travel from Empeyville, which is just outside of Camden, actually. Yeah. From Camden to Rome, New York, to go to the movies. And we traveled out, I don't know what highway it was, but the snow was like 8 and 10 feet snow banks. I couldn't believe that they had that much snow. And go to the movie, and after the movie, they drive you back to the camp.
So would that have been like during the week or on the weekend?
On the weekend.
When we had more
Oh
time?
yeah, you're working. Not during the week.
So did you get to visit Camden while you were in Empeyville?
Not really.
No, you went to Rome.
Right to Rome, right?
Yeah.
Rome. I think we even went to Utica. We even came to Utica once to go to the movie. There were a couple movies on Genesee Street, the old time movies. I can't remember which one.
That's
what
quite
the,
a
what,
trip in the winter.
Oh yes, all day trip, all day up and back. And but the thing I remember about Empeyville was I was there the morning of December the 7th, 1941, in the office listening to the radio, and they came on and said that we're going off the air. The president wants to make an announcement.
Yesterday,
And President Roosevelt came on and announced,
December
this is my
7th,
sad duty to announce to the country that
1941,
the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor.
a date which will
And
live
that's when I heard it.
in
And you were
infamy.
way out in Empeyville.
And I was in Empeyville, sitting in the office, and I heard that. Yep.
What did
And
you-
within the week after that, I was sent from Empeyville to Beltsville, Maryland.
Mr. Thorpe, been enjoying having this conversation with you.
Thank you.
My name is Patricia Shulenburg. I am the project specialist with the Tug Hill Commission. I'd also like to thank Elena Millette and Jennifer Harville for putting together this portion of the presentation. So I'm going to concentrate on the Civilian Conservation Corps in the Tug Hill region, give you an overview of some of the other CCC camps that Marty had not talked about yet, some of the projects that took place in the Tug Hill region, and what that legacy means for the Tug Hill region. The CCC camps in the Tug Hill region included Camden, which was Herb Thorpe's camp, Mansville, Boonville, Little John Game Refuge in Williamstown. Here's a nice map where you can see where they are located. The Camden Camp. It was active from 1935 to 1942. In 1934, the New York State Conservation Department started to buy land again in those 500-acre blocks. These were former farms and woodlots. They bought properties within 15 miles of Swankett Hill, and they provided 50 acres of wind and erosion control. Camden stocked nearly 3,000 fish, rainbow and brook trout, and restored 4.5 miles of stream, both in Fish Creek and the Salmon River. They constructed truck service lanes, 34 watering holes, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, telephone lines, drainage systems, foot, truck, and ski and horse trails. They planted trees on nearly 9,000 acres, collected seed. Primarily conifer seed was collected, and I'll get into those species in a moment. Managed forest. They completed nearly 400 acres of timber harvesting, collected conifer seed, and controlled invasive plants and pathogens on 7,300 acres. 789 days were spent fighting forest fires, and they constructed a fire tower on Swankett Hill. Now let's go to Mansville. The Mansville camp was active from 1935 to 1941. Now this camp stocked over 90,000 fish, both rainbow and brook trout, and they restored 6 miles of streams on the Salmon River. They planted 285 acres of seed for wildlife habitat. They built 4 bridges, constructed water holes, and also built foot, truck, and ski trails. 9,745 acres of trees were planted, again, on those abandoned farmlands, which has formed many of our state forests to this day. They collected, again, conifer seed, provided forest stand improvement, and harvested 390 acres of timber. They collected 410 pounds of hardwood seed, and they provided 2,315 acres of forest pest control. Now let's go to Boonville. A lot of this was covered by Marty, but here's some really great pictures of the Boonville camp and Pixley Falls State Park. So that was one of their major accomplishments, was building Pixley Falls State Park. They planted trees on 8,496 acres, built erosion control on 126 acres, provided gully tree planting, collected conifer seed, and controlled 6,980 acres for forest pathogens and pests. They built 2 bridges, they built sewer systems, built 25 water holes, and constructed truck, foot, and ski trails. This camp also controlled a lot of blister rust fungus that damages white pines by removing gooseberry and currant plants and trimming the branches of infected pine trees. They stocked 22,000 rainbow and brook trout and provided stream restoration on Fish Creek for 10.2 miles. Again, they built Pixley Falls State Park, and they built access roads and prevented forest fires and built the Gomer Hill Fire Tower. Next, we have Little John Game Refuge. That camp was active from 1935 to 1937. They planted 415 acres of trees, collected 191 pounds of hardwood seed, and also collected herbaceous seeds as well. They built bridges, constructed watering holes, and built truck trails. Little John Game Refuge planted seeds and trees on 50 acres specifically for wildlife. They also had experimental areas where they learned about deer management. They controlled blister rust, again that damages the white pines, and stocked 5,460 rainbow and brook trout. They also provided some forest fighting and firefighting services as well. And of course, Little John Game Refuge is really known for their ruffed grouse. It's got a nice, like a feather boa or something. They're really pretty birds. Williamstown, that camp was active from 1935 to 1937. Again, they planted 3,739 acres of trees, improved 865 acres of forest, and provided 3,296 acres of tree and plant disease control. Again, they constructed water holes. These were built to control forest fires in the area. They erected a lot of fencing, and they spent a lot of time transporting materials. This camp was a little less active in stocking fish, but they did restore another 2.2 miles of stream. They provided 54 days of fire hazard reduction and 70 days of that other emergency work that Marty had talked about earlier. You can see some of this work that they have done in Happy Valley Wildlife Management Area. A lot of the planted conifers are still there to this day, and you might be able to see some structures from there as well. They actually moved a town out of the Happy Valley Wildlife Management Area to make room for the state forest. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the work they did. They controlled blister rust fungus, which is a native pathogen to China. The host plants for this are currant and gooseberry, and it impacts the five-needle pines, white and sugar pine. So they removed blister rust fungus by removing the host plants, pruning back tree limbs, and removing infected trees. Of course, white pines are very important to the Tug Hill region because of their timber. They also controlled for Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease came to the U.S. through Holland and Europe. There was timber that was provided for furniture, and there were beetles that were in this. There were beetles in the logs that were going to be made into furniture. They cut and burned trees. This is a picture, it's not from the CCC time, but this is actually Buffalo in, I believe, maybe the 1950s or the 1960s. This is using DDT as an herbicide to treat Dutch elm disease. spraying it everywhere. So we have obviously learned a little bit about proper use of herbicide and application techniques since then, so that's wonderful. And of course, American elms were planted in a lot of parks and along roadsides, so we unfortunately lost a lot of American elm. New York State had bought parcels of abandoned farmland, again in those 500-acre increments, to create our state forests. Many of them you can see in the Tug Hill region. They planted seedlings to provide windbreaks, controlled erosion on abandoned farmland. They really wanted to minimize a lot of the siltation that was going on into our rivers and streams, because there was a lot of fisheries and wildlife decline at the time. How did they collect seeds? They gathered pine cones and hardwood seed to propagate in state nurseries. Seed that they collected were white pine, red pine, Scotch pine, Norway spruce, larch, balsam fir, white cedar, Douglas fir. And they also collected hardwood seed to, not as much as the conifer seed, but they did collect some seed for sugar maples, red maples, American beech, and my favorite, tulip poplar. That's also President Roosevelt's favorite tree. They made experimental plots. So the CCC developed these experimental forestry plots to learn about best management practices and create innovations in managing healthy forests. Our state tree nurseries were also developed in the early 1900s because we needed to reforest our areas. There was over a 20 or 25% decline there was about 20% of state forests left in the late 1800s. So we needed a lot of plants and trees, and we needed them fast. And the best way to do that was to collect seed locally, grow it near the sites in New York. In the Tug Hill region, over 31,000 acres of trees were planted, 6,300 acres of forest stands were improved, and they collected a lot of conifer and hardwood seed. Did you know that the father of American forestry was actually born in the Tug Hill region? That was Franklin B. Howe, born in 1822 in Martinsburg, New York. So I'll give you a little bit of a history that led up to the development of the CCC. Franklin Howe was a doctor, historian, author, and naturalist. He supervised the census back in 1855 and 1870, and he noted that there were severe declines in New York State forests. Again, only 20-25% of New York State was forested, so he noticed this decline and really dedicated a lot of his life to improving that. In 1873, he wrote a paper on the duty of government and the preservation of forests. He actually gave talks at the American Association for the Advancement of Science and proposed that forests be state and federally regulated and that they have schools dedicated to forestry. This committee formed to inform our state legislators and our Congress. In 1876, he was appointed to the USDA as a special agent to continue to assess forests throughout the U.S. And in 1881, he was the first chief of the Division of Forestry, which is the predecessor to the U.S. Forest Service under the USDA. Again, by the late 1800s, there was less than 20% of forests in New York State. This obviously was a concern. And in 1885, New York State created the Forest Preserve Act, which set the pace for conserving forests in our state. In 1911, the New York State Conservation Department, which was pre-New York State DEC, was created in 1911, and then in 29, they passed the State Reforestation Act, which then gave them the authority to buy back that abandoned farmland after a lot of people had abandoned their farms after the Great Depression and start making our state forests and preserving them for a lifetime. kind of my semi-hero at this point. Some of the work that they did in fish stocking and stream restoration, there was a lot of overgrazing and overcutting, obviously, of our forests. Soils were depleted of nutrients. There was a lot of erosion and siltation. Fish and wildlife were in severe decline. The CCC throughout New York State, including the Tug Hill region, protected fish populations by constructing pools, deflecting streams so that it wasn't eroding the stream bank. They conducted channel straightening or narrowing to prevent erosion and controlled the flow of our streams. Some of the streams that they improved in the Tug Hill region were Fish Creek, Salmon River, and Fall Brook. In 1939, they did a creel census on the Salmon River to assess populations of trout and look at their habitat. Here you can see they are in Fall Brook in Lewis County, improving the stream, which usually meant clearing out some debris and creating fish habitat to help the depleted fish populations. In the lower left, that is a scientist at the Rome Fish Hatchery. So a lot of the fish that were grown pre-CCC, the fish hatchery was created before the Civilian Conservation Corps. They received a lot of fingerlings to stock fish in the Tug Hill region. Over 120,000 fish were stocked, and over 22 miles of streams were restored in the Tug Hill. The CCC also created infrastructure and utilities. They created 118 watering holes, which again were used for fire suppression. They constructed roads and trails, phone lines, put up a lot of fencing, which I think back to some of my state park time. I've definitely put up a lot of fences to this day. They created sewer lines, constructed water lines, bridges, fireplaces, and tables and benches. So here's an example of a water hole that was created, again, to fight fires. They created 2 fire towers, both at Gomer Hill and Swankat Hill Forest. They created 3 fire watchman cabins as well, and they spent 2,500 man days fighting active fires. They also spent a lot of time reducing fire hazards, so clearing brush and removing dead trees. And you can find the Gomer Hill Fire Tower at the Lowville Reforestation, Forestry Demonstration Area. That's where one of the cabins that was originally constructed on Gomer Hill can be found today. So the legacy of the CCC in the Tug Hill region, there's a few places where you can see remnants of CCC camps. Again, in Boonville at the Hogsback State Forest, the buildings are gone, but a lot of the roads and other things are still there. Include also in Mansville, the CCC camp in Mansville, a lot of those old roads are still there. You can see the fire roads in the state forest, the rows of evergreens that were planted, of course, Pixley Falls State Park, their original picnic structure is still there. So what does this mean for us today? The CCC really did plant the seed for conservation in our area. There are programs that have developed out of this to this day. There is the Student Conservation Association, the Excelsior Conservation Corps, and AmeriCorps, just to name a few of these programs that you can still see civil engagement and conservation work. So it really set the seed. So what I will do then, and of course there's programs for us to get involved with too. If you're ever interested in the Trees for Trips program or the school seedling program, there are programs and projects available to us to continue to sow the seeds of conservation.
What's tribs?
Tributaries, trees for tributaries. So if you are a homeowner near a stream bank, you can actually apply to receive seedlings and seeds to prevent erosion into your stream. So there are ways to keep this legacy going. I'm going to turn it over to Ann Harrison. Ann is joining us from the New York State DEC. She is the Chief of the Bureau of Environmental Education. So thank you, Ann.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this program. I began my relationship with Corps programs in 1973 when I was hired as a crew supervisor at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. And I actually, instead of driving the troop transport vehicles from World War I got to drive the troop transport vehicles from World War II, and was actually stopped on the New York State Thruway for driving while female. The troopers didn't think that a female should be driving this vehicle. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. So what I'd like to do today is provide a brief overview of a little bit of what the CCC did in New York State, and then talk about how New York State is really, I think, the birthplace of Corps programs. Not only did we have the CCC that was started by President Roosevelt, but when President Roosevelt was the governor of New York State, he had a very similar program of having young men planting trees, doing conservation work. This enabled the president to start the CCC very quickly. He already had a working model, and we were well on its way. The camps operated within months of being signed into legislation. New York State also is the home for the Student Conservation Association, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Plus, we also had several programs that started the models of providing weatherization, climate change, giving young people the opportunity to work as well as go to school and learn trades, which is now Youth Build, which is a national program. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about all of that. As Marty said, New York State had the largest CCC program, and while we eventually had 208 programs, the camps would move around the state. And when a project was finished, they would move to another area. They also moved when it got particularly cold and in the northern Adirondacks, when they were sleeping in tents and an early snow came. That's how one of the camps ended up at Del Mar. And I have to, at this time, give a little shout out to Craig Thompson, who's the former director at the Five Rivers Environmental Education Center, who was which was a site of the CCC camp from 1933 to 36. And he's done a lot of research, and I believe he's writing a book on the program. As Mr. Thorpe mentioned, the camps were segregated, and of the 208 camps in New York, we had 24 that were specifically for African Americans, 4 of which were from World War I vets. People don't realize that Eleanor Roosevelt thought that not only did we need to have camps for young men, but there should also be an opportunity for young women who are just as unemployed and desperate to provide work. And her original thought was to have camps where they would work in the tree nurseries and help propagate the seedlings and the little plants for the CCC boys to plant. The first camp was at Bear Mountain State Park with 90 women. The other camps around the country tended to be at schools, summer resort areas, and others. And the women learned a variety of skills, such as typing, stenography, dressmaking. A few of them did work in nurseries. But a lot of people felt that why should we pay for young women to have a vacation in the woods where everybody was, the rest of the country was in such dire straits. So the program ended in 1937, I believe. People don't know, but Mildred Blanche is believed to be the only female who was actually enrolled as a CCC enrollee. She had graduated, she had finished all of her studies for high school halfway through her senior year, and her advisor said, why don't you go get some work experience? So she went to the Indian service that was on the edge of Winnebago, or her town in Nebraska, and they said, well, we can't pay you, but why don't you volunteer? And she thought, well, this will be a good opportunity for me to get some experience. So she volunteered, and when she graduated from high school, she went back and was pretty persistent in saying, why don't you hire me, why don't you hire me? Eventually, the superintendent of the CCC, it was an Indian camp, said, okay, I'm gonna enroll you as a CCC member if you'll take it. And she said, sure. So she ended up for 2 years working with the Indian service. She was, she distributed the tools, she checked the tools in and out every day, and while the CCC boys were off doing their work projects, she was doing inventory, helping with paperwork, and helping with pay invoices. She eventually took a civil service position, so when she moved to the next Indian Service CCC camp, she was actually a federal employee. And I had the privilege of meeting her back in 1991, and I gotta tell you, it was a thrill. As we've been hearing, the camps were run by a variety of different agencies depending upon what the focus was. So in New York, we had the Park Service basically help develop the parks. We had Forest Service, Army and Soil Conservation Service. And then in New York State, the Department of Forestry and Fish and Wildlife also managed some of the projects. If you visit any state park in New York, you'll be able to see a lot of the improvements. They not only built the roads, but they built bridges. They also built a lot of the stone pavilions, which are so beautiful, and they actually, they call it parkitecture, because the CCC created designs that were used around the country that people want to use today. The Soil and Conservation Service, also, as people have, as Patricia and Marty have explained, a lot of flood prevention, soilization, control and everything. This is Letchworth State Park, and if you go to Letchworth, you'll see the stone picnic tables and the stone pavilions. Reforestation camps, Patricia did explain kind of why they were needed, and the fact that they purchasing camps or purchasing farms that were being abandoned, not only in the Adirondacks but in central New York and western New York, was very important to reestablishing the state park system, because forestry is it's huge not only for recreation and wildlife management, but also for economic benefits. The picture on your left is one, I believe, of where Mr. Thorpe was stationed for a while. We talked about the forest pest and disease control. Spongy moth used to be called gypsy moth. It has recently been changed to spongy moth, but that was a very important component of protecting our forest resources. The camp at Del Mar was very involved with upland game and waterfowl restoration. It was one of 3 camps in New York State that were designed to propagate geese, black duck, mallards, and ruffed grouse and pheasant. As a matter of fact, the grouse studies that were done at Del Mar turned out to be like the seminal book on grouse and the grouse management and grouse habitat and everything you wanted to know about grouse. There's one of the water holes that the CCC members created, as well as fire towers. Looking back, the resource benefits that New York State reaped from the CCC are just tremendous, about not only the number of trees planted, insects controlled, etc. The economic benefits for the people that were not only in the CCC, as Marty mentioned, $25 went back to their home families. $5 the CCC members got to keep themselves. I live now in Gallupville, which is the site of one of the CCC camps, and one of my neighbors told me that his father owned the local little, gas station, grocery store, come in and buy your milk and your bread and eggs and a few other things. And he said that on the days that the CCC boys got paid their $5, he would make sure that his cooler was stocked full of Coca-Cola because they loved having, a cold can of Coke. In addition to, the economic development, the natural resource development, as Marty, Mr. Thorpe mentioned, that the CCC boys came in, they were hungry, they didn't have much hope, they didn't have many skills. CCC taught them various vocational skills that they would use for the rest of their life. They taught them how to work in teams. They gave them discipline, and they also provided training for getting their GED and learning a little bit more about the world. The intangibles were the camaraderie, I think, that the CCC folks had. We've heard that in their spare time, they had boxing, baseball, and bands. And that was one of the things where they could all work together and also enjoy their times together. The CCC helped the people not only in New York State, but in the country, realize how precious their natural resources were, but also provided access to a lot of the resources that formerly would not have been available to people. There was also the interest now in maintaining and helping with the stewardship of our natural resources. And in talking with the CCC members that I've spoken to, many of them were very, very proud of the fact that having served in the CCC, they were able to quickly get ready to head off to World War II because they were used to living in barracks. They were used to working in teams. They were used to being given commands, and they also were physically fit. So 1942, as America entered World War II, it brought the end of the CCC camps, and the last camp closed in New York State in June of 1942. July. After the war, New York State did have a small program with about 200 men a year continuing to do the tree planting and natural resource management. But the core concept is too good to just fade away and be part of history. Thanks to Liz Cushman Titus Putnam, she created the Student Conservation Association. In her freshman year, she took a new course called Conservation of Natural Resources, which was pretty much, it was a brand new course, interdisciplinary. And in her junior year, Liz read an article in Harper magazine basically saying that the national parks were in such bad shape that they should be closed. The Army should not allow people to come to them. And until the federal government puts more money into the national parks, we should just close them down. She thought there was another way to do it. She had read about the CCC and decided that having students and young adults do volunteer work on national parks would be the way to go instead of closing them down. So once she graduated, her senior advisor said, are you willing to put 2 years worth of work into trying to get this idea off the ground? And she had some lucky connections and was able to go around to 4 of the parks to find out whether their superintendents would be interested in having such a program at their parks. And it's interesting to note that when Liz was sending out information or asking for support, she would sign her name E. Sanford Cushman, because at that time she thought that if she used her name Liz or Elizabeth, that people wouldn't take her seriously. So in 1957, in June, the first SCA volunteers appeared at Grand Teton and Olympic National Parks, and they worked during the summer months, providing stewardship efforts, trail work, did some interpretive work in the program, as well as helped out with some of the administrative work. Liz incorporated the Student Conservation Association in 1964, and the programs kept growing as superintendents would move from one national park to another. They would say, whoa, I want to have an SEA crew. So the number of crews kept expanding throughout the years. And some of you may remember that back in the late 1980s, there were some very severe forest fires that pretty much devastated Yellowstone National Park. And the National Association of Service and Conservation Corps and the Student Conservation Association created a 2-year Yellowstone Recovery Corps that helped to rebuild the trails, replant the trees, and help restore the park to be enjoyed by other visitors. And SCA continues, as do other corps, throughout the country. Whenever there's a disaster, corps are usually there to help out. Liz has been given many, many awards, but she's very proud of the fact that in 2010, she was the first conservationist to earn the Presidential Citizens Award, which is the second highest civilian award. And Liz is still going strong. She, in 2016, received the New York State Outdoor Education Association Leadership Award, and she also comes to various recognition ceremonies for various SEA core programs. I think you've met her. Maria will be next, and she can explain, but she, what her programs are doing. But Liz likes to come. She gets energized by seeing the programs continuing. So the Student Conservation Association is now the largest provider of conservation programs, and by the end of this year, they expect to have 100,000 alumni. Liz really did change the scope of conservation service by not only having young men work, but young women work in conservation projects and high schools, and have expanded it into urban areas. In the late 1960s, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson from the state of Washington liked the SCA model concept and created the legislation for the Youth Conservation Corps. And this was a program that was started to have people work in national parks, Fish and Wildlife Service areas, and National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. It was basically high school kids, 15 to 18-year-olds, working on conservation projects, but 25% of their time was spent in learning about the environment, environmental concepts, and doing environmental readings as well. And even though the program was ended nationally in 1982, some of the federal programs still have continued it. Building upon the CCC and SCA, the Young Adult Conservation Corps was a year-round program for older, 16 to 25-year-olds. It was part of the Comprehensive Employment and Training Acts back in the 70s and 80s. There were several of the Department of Labor had programs that helped unemployed young men and women get jobs. So the CCC was a chapter, the Young Adult was part of that. As the local programs and the local and states started to see the value of the CCC and the SCA program, they created their own. And quite a few states, California, Maine, Iowa, Vermont, Minnesota, a bunch of other states created their own statewide core programs, and municipalities such as San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, Philadelphia also created programs. And in the 1980s, the City Volunteer Corps was actually the largest urban corps in the country that had 700 members whose teams were made up of people from each of the region, each of the boroughs. They didn't have just the Bronx team and the Brooklyn team. They mixed them all up so that people don't realize that New York City can be pretty provincial, and people from Staten Island have never been to Brooklyn or vice versa. So the New York City Volunteer Corps was the first to also offer programs in human services, in doing working in soup kitchens, working in food banks, helping to tutor kids, besides working in the parks. In the early 1980s, a bunch of us were getting together to try and create revitalize the federal funding for core programs. And I'm proud to say that I was a founding member of the National Association of Service Conservation Corps, which is now called the Corps Network. And that was an umbrella for all of the various organizations that come together. We did a lot of how to start a core programs around the states. And we also put out information about best practices for running core programs. In 1983, New York State Legislature passed a New York Conservation Corps program. It wasn't funded until 1988, and for 3 summers we had programs for 15 to 18-year-olds on a grant basis. And the legislation put the management of the program in the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, but they dictated how much of the money, so much would go to state parks, so much to DEC, so much to Indian nations, municipalities, and not-for-profits. In the early 1900s, a lot of people credit President Clinton with creating AmeriCorps, but before that, there was the American Conservation and Youth Service Corps Act of 1990 that was signed by President Bush, who also created the 1,000 Points of Light Foundation to recognize volunteers in around the country. So the federal program really enabled the core programs to take off and doubled in a couple of years. So then the program was amended in 1993 to add service programs to the legislation, but very importantly, it also added a educational benefit so that if you are working for 10 months in an AmeriCorps program, you have the opportunity to have an education award that will be given to either your institution, if you're going to go to graduate school, or you're going to go to college or to a trade school. It also can be used to pay off some of your student loans as well. And currently, it's $6,000. It's a little over $6,000. So it's a nice, it's a nice educational benefit. And quite a few of the colleges and universities around the country also will match your education award. And in today's, in New York State's AmeriCorps programs, we have quite a few. They are administered by the New York State Commission on National and Community Service, and Linda Cohen, who is the executive director, was our executive director for the New York State Corps Coalition when we all got together and decided, instead of competing against each other to apply for the federal grants, we would work together as one. And so Linda was our first and only executive director for the Corps Coalition, and is now heading up the commission that manages the AmeriCorps programs. I'm going to quickly go through some of the programs that DEC currently has. The first one that we started to partner with SEA was in 1998 with a residential Corps program up in the Adirondacks, doing a lot of the same things that the Corps members in the 1930s were doing. Restoring trails, now making them some of them handicapped accessible, working in campgrounds and making, doing some timber stand improvement, et cetera. The Hudson Valley AmeriCorps was started a year later and it's a slightly different model. We have individual placements where they're college graduates who work in state parks, DEC, and nonprofit organizations, basically doing environmental education and outreach. The Excelsior Conservation Corps, Patricia mentioned that a little bit, was a State of the State initiative in 2015 and got started in 2016. And Maria's a proud member of the ECC, so we're very happy. I told Maria earlier that whenever I see on an application, if I'm hiring a position, if I see any Corps work, any national service work, the resume goes to the top of the pile. So I'm glad to see that that's been working out. This Corps program that we worked on, it was a residential program, much like the CCC. They had a home base for the first several years. They were home based at SUNY Morrisville or at Brockport. And then they would go on what we call hitches, which the CCC called site camps, and they would go and spend 10 days or so working on site, sleeping in tents, cooking outside. Unfortunately, the pandemic really impacted the ECC program, and we were reduced. The 2020 program was canceled literally 3 weeks after it started because we were at SUNY Sullivan County, and they closed down their campus. Everybody had to go home. Last year was a little bit of a struggle. We only had about 17 members, and this year we had some folks that were ready to be hired, but they then found other full-time jobs, and then the program director left for personal reasons as well. So without any supervision, staff, we can't run an ECC. So DEC and Parks are now in the process of sitting down, looking at the programs, looking at the various models, and saying, okay, what do we want to do as we move forward? The Civilian Climate Corps is a proposal in the federal Build Back Better bill. So there's some hope that perhaps that will be another influx into money into the AmeriCorps program. One thing I did want to point out that the ECC did do is they restored one of the CCC buildings at Five Rivers Environmental Education Center. It's called the Goose Lodge because, as I mentioned, they raised geese and various waterfowl out there. And it was in quite a bit disrepair, and the CC members, not only they repointed the foundation, they plugged up the holes, they painted it, they helped put in the new windows, and now it's an active, it's where they have their maple sugaring program every year and is used for meeting space as well. Today, there are 140 corps around the country that are going strong in every single state in the country, in the U.S., as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Many people call, the people that worked or that fought in World War II the greatest generation, and it's well deserved. And again, a lot of the CCC members that I talked to said that they were able to be so successful and so fast in World War II was because of their CCC experience. And I want to say that I think we're well on the way for the next greatest generation. When I wrote the first grant for New York State for the National Service program, and I started it with the statement. It was a speech on the shores of the Hudson River in an FDR's homestead, the national park there, and it was the 100th anniversary. It was March of 2033. And it was the 100th anniversary of the CCC, which isn't that far off. But as the President of the United States, she was the first Hispanic woman who was a Corps member, who credited her time working in a Corps and learning various skills, people skills, conservation skills, and service skills that allowed her to continue on a path of public service. And so I kind of had her reflecting back on the CCC and all the Corps programs. And I think she's still out there. So I'm looking forward to that. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions later on.
What an incredible legacy that's still holding strong today throughout New York State. Next, I'd like to introduce Maria Cipullo. She is the Regional Trails Coordinator at the Thousand Islands Region State Park. And she is going to talk a little bit about the work that they are completing in the Tug Hill region. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Maria, and I am the Regional Trails Coordinator for Thousand Islands State Parks. So what that means is I oversee the Trails program in 28 different state parks, and I have some trail staff, and I also have some SCA members. So as Ann mentioned, we have the New York State Parks Corps, and I supervise the Thousand Islands branch of the New York State Parks Corps, but we have different site locations in the Adirondacks, the Central Region, Genesee, Niagara, Allegheny, and Finger Lakes. And it's a collaboration of learning-based positions located throughout the state. This year we have 25 members, and they're provided with housing, a living stipend, and an education grant once they finish the program. And they can choose to serve either 10 months or 5 months, very similar to the CCC. They can serve up to 2 years and still get the education grant. So our Thousand Islands Corps, this map shows that it's like Lewis County, Jefferson, St. Lawrence, Clinton County. We cover Lake Ontario, Thousand Islands, and Lake Champlain. And my 4 conservation stewards that I directly supervise move around the region weekly, so they will work on site at different state parks and camp while they're there. And we have 3 environmental educators who are permanently stationed on Wellesley Island. But today we're talking about Tug Hill, which we know is the bottom part there. And in Tug Hill, we have Black River Trail, Whetstone Gulf State Park, and if you're being a little generous, Eastern Lake Ontario. So at the Black River Trail, it's a very self-sustaining park. We really don't have to do much to maintain it, but we do revisit every year in May as part of the I Love My Parks Day initiative, where we gather a group of volunteers and we'll cut back the overgrowth and look for any invasive plants that are growing along the trail. So the picture on the left is in 2019. The members in the SCA program are in green shirts. And what they were doing is driving the gator up and down the road, collecting debris, and they were a huge help. We actually got a lot done in just 2 hours' time. And Whetstone Gulf is certainly where we spend a lot of our time. So we have nearly 5.5 miles of trail that goes up and around the gorge, and we also have a 1.3 mile fitness trail. There's beautiful overlooks in that park, and there's basically nothing but tall pines. So there's red pines and white pines. I will make that correction. And if you look at just those two pictures, you can kind of see that even down in the camp loop, there are trees in rows, and I was not able to confirm it, but I would be pretty confident that it was probably the CCC that planted all of those trees. And it has gorgeous views, so you'll see our SCA members at two different vantage points of the gorge, wearing their gear and their hard hats, which are essential when we're doing any sort of chainsaw work. And here we are, working towards public safety. So on the left, you see an example of a hazard tree, and on the right, you'll see one of our members taking a tree down. And we try and utilize any dead and down trees that we do take. We try and give them a second life in another project. So here you see a culvert that had completely eroded away and was no longer working. So we actually went down on the downstream slope of the culvert, and we installed check dams with the timber that we had taken from other trees. And we were able to actually get the soil to stop moving and allow revegetation of the area with native plants. And then in that same location, we prepped the ground, and we actually built a 50-foot bridge at the top of a 1,000-foot gain of a hiking trail. So it was no easy feat getting all of the parts up there. So here you'll see our members in 2021 working to level the ground, and then also working on the railing portion of the bridge. And then we've got a nice panoramic view of the bridge right before we put the decking on. And here's the finished project. So in total, it took us 6 weeks, including stabilizing the stream on the bottom and removing the culvert, prepping the ground, installing the bridge, and putting the decking on. It was a huge learning curve, and all of this work was completed just by a group of 4 AmeriCorps members and 1 trail staff member. So it was really amazing to see it come out and be such a beautiful structure. And more uses for those already felled trees. So what you see in these pictures are a member in 2021 and this year's member on the right. They are milling the trees so that they have a flat surface, so we can actually use those as footers for bog bridges. And this is the project just a couple weeks ago. We were up at Whetstone again. And this is an area that is seasonally wet, and it's more of a seep than an actual stream crossing, so there's no way around it. And it's best practice if it's already wet to build something on top, so that way hikers don't get off of the trail and make it even worse. So this way we can get them out of the water and more likely to stay in the center of the trail. And you'll see our members, so we have Max, Omar, and Caroline this year doing excellent work up at Whetstone Gulf, and they've actually installed 100 feet of boardwalk already, so they're doing great work. And then I just wanted to give some acknowledgement to the Excelsior Conservation Corps. They did come through and camp at Whetstone Gulf, and they actually provided service at Otter Creek Horse Trails and the Independence River Wild Forest. And so that picture is from 2018. They were using that down timber to construct different sorts of water bars and retaining walls. And there's another photo here of them actually making the water bar, which is a way to control the water that's running onto a trail and causing drainage issues. And then just as a last second, so my program is designed for not only providing service, but also providing some education opportunities for the members. So here we have a picture of them doing more of like a field research aspect. They're doing emerald ash borer surveys at Westgate Beach. And then on the right, they're providing that service again. They actually ended up cutting 2 acres worth of buckthorn down and controlling for that invasive. So that was in 2020 when we couldn't move around. They stayed in that park and lived on site and just took care of 2 acres worth of buckthorn, and it was really kind of amazing. And some other things that we dabble in is historic restoration. So these pictures show the Union Hotel in Sackett's Harbor. Our crew painted with mold-killing primer in the entire first floor, so that way the building can be used for programming. And then we also repointed the basement foundation of the building because it was flooding every year. So we were able to go back through with historically accurate mortar, and we actually did quite a bit of repointing. There was 7 walls in total that we finished between last year and this year. And of course, the pictures that come out of it are always great. So these are all pictures that were taken at Whetstone Gulf, and I just wanted to share them with you today to remind everybody that even though Tug Hill can get forgotten about sometimes, there's beautiful things out there. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. The work that you guys are doing in the Tug Hill region and throughout the Thousand Islands is absolutely incredible, and that Union Hotel is being used for programming now, so excellent work to the Conservation Corps. And she makes a very fantastic Jell-O, so if you have chance, join us for some Jell-O after the program. So I do have some resources about the CCC in New York State and in the Tug Hill. So if you do want to check out Marty Podskoch, his book, you can get it on Amazon. We do have a copy at the table as well if you want to peruse it before you buy. Of course, a lot of the material for our presentations have come from the New York State Department of Education and the Digital Archives collection. So there's amazing pictures there. I definitely encourage you to check it out. Type in some search words, including Civilian Conservation Corps, and you can see a lot of pictures from work that was done back in the 1930s. There's actually a link here too that I really like. It's called the New Deal Map. It's from the livingnewdeal.org, and it's an interactive map where you can actually see some of the projects undertaken by the Civilian Conservation Corps, including some of our state forests, post offices, murals, and former campsites. So definitely check that out. Before I open it up for questions, we do have an online survey, so you can give us some of the feedback today. Let us know how our program was. Apologize for some of the computer glitches, but thank you very much for joining us today. We do want to hear back from you so that we can continue to provide quality programming.